Two truckers want the state of Minnesota to allow them to carry firearms using permits issued in other states. The lawsuit filed by the Liberty Justice Center says Minnesota violates the Second Amendment by not honoring gun permits issued in 29 other states. Those truckers are licensed to carry guns in Texas, Georgia, and Florida. The suit claims Minnesota's policy places an unfair burden on those who normally travel across state lines as part of their employment. We're joined by Liberty Justice Center Senior Counsel Loren Seehase, the lead attorney on the case. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Loren, what do these truckers have to do if they cross state lines where their concealed carry permit is not honored and they have a gun in their truck?
So what they have to do is they have to comply with this patchwork of laws across the country. So every time they're approaching a state line, they have to identify, okay, what state laws do I have to be in compliance with? So an example one of the plaintiffs gave me was that as he travels up a certain highway, passing through several states, before he hits that state border, he has to pull over, unload his gun or disassemble it in accordance with whatever state law, lock it away in a box, stow it safely, cross that state, and then as he gets to another state that allows his permit, then he has to stop at another rest stop, get his firearm back out, load it back up, put it back on his hip, so he has to comply with every state's law.
So are these truckers saying they don't want to abide by every state's law, that they basically are saying, I don't care about what your state law is, I just want to carry my gun?
No, that's not what they're saying. I mean, obviously these are law-abiding citizens who are taking the time to make sure that they're in compliance with state laws as they're crossing these, before they're crossing these borders. But what they are saying is that the right to self-defense doesn't end when you cross state lines. So if you start looking at, us as a country, we have this right to travel. We have the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, and we have laws in place that allow for reciprocity for other things. So you have a driver's license in whatever state you're in, and that's recognized as a lawfully issued document by a state agency if you move to another state. You have your birth certificate. If you move to another state, they're not going to question your birth certificate. It's a lawfully issued document from the state government. Same with a marriage license. And so we have case law and we have federal law that says that, states are supposed to recognize these documents that are issued from governments, from courts. So that way we have this right to travel, this ability to freely move, and transport ourselves and our family across state lines without these hindrances.
So has a Minnesota judge or court allowed a hearing on this bill? If so, when will it be heard? Not bill, this lawsuit, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So the lawsuit was just filed. We're in the very early stages of it. We're looking at least a few months before the court is going to hear substantively the arguments. And the arguments are basically that it violates the Second Amendment. I touched on the full faith and credit. I touched on the right to travel. But the argument in the complaint itself is that it violates the Second Amendment. So that's the key piece here.
Why do states not honor concealed carry permits from some states? Is it because they say that their laws are different than the other state?
That's primarily what they say publicly. If there's other, underlying reasons as to why they recognize other states, it's not clear from the public records or, the public websites as to why. Because when you start to look at it, so Minnesota, for example, their state law says that they're going to annually look at the state permit regimes of all the other states and determine if it's similar to Minnesota's. So if it's similar, then they'll recognize it and they'll say, yes, you can have reciprocity in our state. If it's not similar, then they won't. But there's no criteria for what they determine to be similar. And so when I was looking at the state laws, between like Texas and Minnesota, there's a lot of similarities. They have age requirements. You have to pass background checks. You got to get fingerprinted. You've got to make sure that you're not, prohibited from carrying a firearm by the federal government. You can't have any of these like felony convictions. So there's a lot of similarities. So where is the difference? And I think that their list in Minnesota is pretty arbitrary.
You know, it wouldn't be surprising to me if a lawsuit like this one filed by your organization hasn't been brought forth before. Has a lawsuit been brought forth on this topic? And if so, why has it been struck down?
So I don't think that there's been a lawsuit in Minnesota brought on Minnesota's laws. I think that this is a new area of law in the sense of it hasn't been challenged yet before. There's been a lot of talk. You know, I mentioned those kind of constitutional underpinnings. You've got this right to travel. You've got this full faith and credit. It feels like a constitutional right shouldn't be infringed just because you cross state lines. And so what is the underlying claim here? And that's the Second Amendment. And the reason it hasn't been tested is we have the most recent Bruin case by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that basically changed the analysis of Second Amendment cases. And so it now says that in order for a firearm law today, and I'm generalizing here, in order for a firearm law today to be valid, then the state who has the firearm law has the burden of showing that historically there was a very similar firearm law or restriction on firearms or the right to bear arms. So right now, what happens is when we go to court, we're going to show that there isn't any historical analog. There wasn't historically any restrictions on out-of-state residents visiting other states and not being able to carry their firearm, or an out-of-state resident having to seek permission from the visiting state to carry their firearm, or an out-of-state resident's firearm permit not being recognized as valid by the visiting state. So there's not any historical analogs for laws. And actually what I found was that there were historical laws. And when I say historical, it's going back to the time of the ratification of the Second Amendment. There is argument to be made that at the time of the 14th Amendment, which is when the Second Amendment became applicable to the states. Either way, those time periods, there weren't any laws that were similar to Minnesota's failure to recognize the firearm permits from other states. Instead, there were actually laws on the books that required travelers to carry firearms when crossing state lines.
That is interesting.
Like, hey, yes. To me, in my mind, I was thinking like Oregon Trail, you covered wagon, you're going across state lines, and the state's saying, hey, you need to be protected, so you need to have firearms. So I thought that was very interesting. And I think it's important for this case because there was a recent Eighth Circuit case just last year that struck down Minnesota's ban on 18 to 20-year-olds. So the same firearm permit scheme that we're challenging was challenged by another organization, and they were challenging the ban on 18 to 20-year-olds obtaining firearm permits in Minnesota. And the Eighth Circuit, when looking at the history of, historical analog, because that's our Second Amendment analysis, found that there wasn't any restrictions prohibiting 18 to 20-year-olds from carrying firearms at the time of the ratification of the Second Amendment or 14th Amendment. And instead, there was actually laws on the books that required young men, 18 to 20-year-olds, to carry firearms. So I think that that's very important for our case as well, that we have these old laws that said travelers had to carry firearms.
So I got a press release from North Dakota Republican Senators John Hoeven and Kevin Kramer as I was preparing for this interview, and I found it interesting. They've introduced a bill along with 41 other senators to allow people with concealed carry permits in their home state to use them in any other state. And Senator Hoeven says it's important this bill protects state rights by not making a national standard for concealed carry and treating permits like driver's licenses to work across state lines. And I've got to believe that you're in favor of this, but it would also make your job safe a lot easier. So do you think this lawsuit or this bill in Washington will be done first?
Oh, that's a good question. We could place bets on that. It's possible that the bill will get done first. I know that, federal courts have a tendency to move quickly, and we're hoping that this case moves quickly. So I'm not sure which one will come into place first. I think the latest draft of the bill said that it would be effective 90 days after signing. So it's possible that we could get a decision in our court case before then. But it's a very interesting issue, and I do think that a national bill would help. And if it doesn't, pass for whatever reason, then I think that this court case is very important.